Thanks for joining us once again on our Top Lines and Tails podcast. This week, as always, we're fortunate to be sponsored by Harbro, suppliers and manufacturers of quality livestock nutrition. Welcome to another edition of Top Lines and Tails and to our history of native livestock breeds that we've been looking at. And a few weeks ago, we looked at the history of Robert Bakewell, and now we're moving into one of the breeds that he was involved in, the great Longhorn breed. And I'm very pleased to have on the call today Clive Rhodes, who was secretary of the Longhorn Society from 1975 to 1983, I believe, and an auctioneer of some standing, originally with John Thornborough and then more recently with McCartneys. And I believe are you chairman of McCartneys these days, Clive?
No, I've because I'm 65 on our partnership deed, you have to sell your shares. And so when I was 65 in 2020, I had to sell my shares and give up the chairmanship. So I'm now a consultant.
Excellent.
Which is a fancy title for doing the same thing for less money.
I thought it'd be for more money.
I wish.
Well, Clive, welcome to the podcast. And also we have Peter Close. Peter, farming Fishwick Mains there in Berwickshire on the lovely banks of the River Tweed, and past Longhorn chairman, council member of the Longhorn Society for just about all of the years of the last 4 decades, 32 years, I think, Peter, and been breeding Longhorn since 1976. Substantial breeder, winner of just about everything, including 13 female championships at the Royal Show. So a massive record there behind you, Peter. Before we move on to the more recent Longhorns, we dealt with Bakewell's influence upon the breed in the last podcast, and we'll cover a little bit more of that in a bit more detail, maybe slightly different to the podcast that we put out a few weeks ago. But let's say from Bakewell's demise, I think in 1795, that the fortunes of the Longhorn breed have been pretty much a roller coaster. And at first, Bakewell's band of disciples kept the breed stable in the face of increasing popularity of the Shorthorn, of course, for obvious reasons. And a number of Longhorns, along with Herefords, were exported to America in the 1820s to cross on what they call the Longhorn, which of course is a Spanish Criollo cattle there in Texas, the Texas Longhorn. And to this day, there are a number of Texas Longhorns that still hold that finchback pattern, which of course is characteristic of the Longhorn breed. But they're essentially, those ones are composites, and they're not what we would call a Longhorn. Let's put it that way. And as we move into the first decades of the 19th century, this empire began to crumble a little bit, and not so much from the onslaught of the Shorthorn, but rather from the breed's own shortcomings, I believe. And 6 years, of course, of the Durham ox. And the Durham ox would be exhibited up and down the country for all those years until eventually he grew into about 3 ton and fell and broke his hip. Was a magnificent animal that seemed to be stealing all the headlines. The next 40-odd years, the Longhorn could easily have slipped out of existence altogether had it not been for a few faithful breeders who, having seen the mistakes that some of their predecessors made, began to start turning things around. So that's sort of a history going into the 18th century. And Peter, of these particular note were the Chapmans of Nuneaton and, of course, the Crewe family at Colk Abbey there in Derbyshire. But the Longhorn was undoubtedly an aesthetic appeal for his docility proved to be a tremendous asset to these people.
Well, I think its fortunes very much reflected its aesthetic nature and docility. And when it was appearing at the shows and the landed gentry had money, the Longhorn boomed, regardless of the fact that it had horns. Mm-hmm. But when they weren't at the shows and poverty hit the landed gentry, repeal of the Corn Laws in 1866 didn't help. Things, it was a roller coaster, and the same has been true right through to the 1960s.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, and as you mentioned, the shows there, we'll maybe touch on that in a little bit more, but I know the shows like the Royal and Bingley Hall and Smithfield, the 1850s, they certainly did draw the attention if these animals were there being exhibited, but it was all about getting the classes, making sure that they had the numbers and the animals there in the classes, I suppose. And of course, many of the breeds initiated their herd books in the 1870s, and we've seen that with Coates' Shorthorn book, of course, and it was the same with the Longhorn. So the first herd book in the 1870s. And I gather from John Brigg, who, of course, was secretary of the Longhorn Society up until 1975, when I think you took it over, Clive, that he said this was largely the Longhorn herd book was largely driven to enable tariff-free entry into the United States as pedigree breeding stock. So it's not even about keeping the pedigrees of the animals so much as making sure they had a pedigree on them so they can ship them overseas as breeding animals at a time when, if they went over as meat or slaughter stock, then they were being taxed on being brought into the country, of course. And if we just stick with those Americans as well, at this time the Great Plains were being colonized, of course, and cleared of the buffalo and being restocked with domestic livestock, and we've spoke about that a few times on this podcast. And John was at pains to point out that in Volume 1 of the Longhorn Herd Book, printed in 1878, a statement, and I'm going to read it out word for word as it's written in that early herd book. It was noted in 1870s that Bakewell's predilection to produce the smallest possible amount of bone and the greatest aptitude to fatten tended to weaken of the constitution of the loss of lean flesh and muscle, as well as injury to the breeding and milking properties of the cattle so bred. So it must be traced to the decline of the Longhorns in the early part of the present century. So basically, John is saying that contrary to what we've said on previous podcasts, that maybe Bakewell didn't do the good with the Longhorn breed, particularly as everybody seems to think that he did. And it's not a controversial point. I think, Peter, you may have told me, or certainly somebody told me, that some of the best Longhorn cattle are the ones that Bakewell didn't get his hands on. Would that be right?
Well, that's what I was told many years ago. Well, allegedly, the original Longhorns came from Lancashire and the Craven district of Yorkshire. And obviously, we know that Bakewell got some from there. But reputedly, the ones he didn't get his hands on led to the long-term improvement of the breed.
That would be, as I said, in contrast with the podcast that we recently put out, of course, with myself and Clive Davis, and to the antagonism little bit of his great band of followers worldwide to this day, who hail him as the father of many things agricultural, including, of course, his sheep and his horses. And it certainly made strides and taught us taught the world breeding tactics that we didn't absolutely have before. But on the other hand, you're saying maybe all those tactics were to the detriment of that particular breed. As we move on into the 20th century, the two world wars, the Longhorns' fortunes continued on this roller coaster, always being based on their attractive looks and docility, but that reflected on how affluent, I suppose, the landed gentry were at that time, and whether the breed appeared at these shows. And Clive, it's damn hard to promote a breed when if you can't get it out and take it to your show and have classes for it, isn't it?
Absolutely, that's the whole point of agricultural shows is selling your wares. And if you're behind a closed door and nobody sees them, you've got to push water uphill, which obviously is impossible. So it's essential that if whatever breed you've got, you want to get out there and show it and its attributes and then sell some stock on the back of it.
There would have been some reasons behind this. We've all been involved in agricultural shows, all three of us, and at various times. And I know with the likes of Smithfield, if there weren't enough numbers forward in 2 or 3 years in a row, then the classes were taken from them. And there would be people who would have bias who were sitting on these councils in their bowler hats, if I can't be too rude about it. And some of these people would need to be enthusiasts of the breed to make sure that the classes got forward. And I suppose eventually that was what happened.
The industry's always been a case of vested interest, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Well, life in general is about pushing yourself forward and trying to get to the top, obviously, and that's what an agricultural show's about. That's what competition is all about, whether it's in the show ring or anywhere else. Really, it's competition, and those that get to the top get a reputation and sell their stock. So that's just life, isn't it?
I suppose it is. And by 1949, only a handful of enthusiasts remained, with Ted Walters of Grendon as secretary of the society from 1932 to 1972. So a long stint for Ted. And, of course, the herd book had lapsed during that time. And then he was on hand to start compiling the next herd book. And I think that was 1949. And in there were half a dozen or more breeders, including Ted himself, and Noakes of the Hill herd, Stanhope of the Watling herd, Wales of the Stoke herd, Johnson of the Welland and Ibrook herd, Tomlinson of the Armitage herd, and Unwin from the Longhorn herd. So those were the main men, I suppose, that were about when the breed was starting to come back a little bit. And those first 3 volumes covered a 13-year span. So the breed was getting safe, but it was still pretty precarious, wasn't it? I mean, they needed to do something by then.
Well, there was nothing going on because it essentially hadn't got a commercial role. And without that, whether that commercial role be pretty looks or good beef or all sorts of breeding suckler cows or whatever, without a commercial role, you're struggling.
Indeed, and maybe rudder us a little bit as to where that commercial role was going to play. And possibly the turning point, Clive, would be in the 1963 Royal Show, before our day, I know, but when it moved to its fantastic permanent base there at Stoneleigh, and the Longhorn classes came in there, and then the show went on to be a fantastic event, and I'm sorry it's not still there.
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't before my day, Andy. You're such a young, fresh-faced boy. some of us were quite old by 63, and well remember the first show there at Stoneleigh, which was a bit of a quagmire, but that's another story. But yeah, Longhorn classes were introduced, and then we moved on to the early 1970s, probably 15 breeders. Then things did start to move, really, because obviously the beginning of the 1970s really were halcyon days for the beef trade. We were coming out of the doldrums, the Rare Breed Survival Trust was being formed, the continental breeds were being imported, there's just a sway of interest in the beef cycle in general, really, and obviously the Longhorns were lucky enough to get caught up in that, and various sales ensued during the 70s. But yeah, in general, it was good years for the beef trading, and everybody got swept along with it.
Indeed. And you mentioned briefly the Rare Breed Survival Trust. Of course, one of the herds would be Joe Henson, who is one of the main men behind the Rare Breed Survival Trust. And I'm going to do a podcast on the RBST itself because it gets so regularly mentioned here on this series. But Henson's involvement would actually be almost as significant as Bakewell in some ways, in a different way, because obviously he saw this breed and a few others and with the Longhorn breed, and that of course may be part of the instigation that was behind the Rare Breed Survival Trust.
Yeah, and to be fair, obviously, we all know Adam Henson and Country File and the Cotswold Farm Park, but Joe was obviously the instigator of the Cotswold Farm Park, which in those days was pretty monumental, really. But he got an area of his farm that wasn't particularly good for arable, grew some grass, but not very good, and obviously had an eye, for the future and thinking that people would be interested in seeing these breeds that weren't very common, and obviously Rare Breeds then fits the bill, and you've got Longhorns, you've got White Parks, you've all the other minority breeds that, to be fair to Joe, he was looking at basically to show people and get people through the turnstile.
Certainly, he gave them a home, and he drew a bit back from it. That's a brilliant thing, and as I said, we will, in a subsequent series, we'll mention that in a bit more detail. Just going back into the 70s, unfortunately, the deaths of a couple of the stalwarts of the breed in the 70s, Stanhope, Noakes, and Waters, who was the secretary, the society needed a shake-up, and another man we mentioned earlier on, and again instrumental in this Longhorn story, was John Brigg, of course, and John was elected secretary and entrusted with the job of bringing the herd book up to date from 1967, and in 1973 there were 50 females and 9 bulls registered, indicating that the population of the breed was going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, and all credit to John Brigg, because he was an enthusiast in those days, and enthusiastic enough to take the secretaryship on as an honorarium. Really, didn't really got paid for doing it, but he was enthusiastic enough to take up all the literature and so on, and start to form a herd book, which was no mean feat, to be fair. In those days, it's a lot easier now with computers and all the rest of the recording paraphernalia, but in those days it was almost a quill pen and a piece of paper. So all credit to John Brigg, who has actually kept the breed going in the early days.
Indeed, as you said, a monumental task. And I know when we discussed Coates with his herd book and riding around the country on his white horse, calling on farms with his satchel full of papers, and I'm not sure John was quite that archaic, but as you said, it's a lot harder than nowadays with the computers to put that in. And I think a few of these dispersals, from what I can gather from fantastic information that Peter's has given me, some of these dispersals then would bring in more breeders, and the Hill herd dispersed in March 1973, 32 females and 4 bulls, and that saw 7 new herds coming in from that one dispersal, including Charles Cottrell Dormer at Rowsham. And I remember Cottrell Dormer being a big name within the breed when I was younger, going to the shows. Clive, you remember him surely?
Yes, still going strong, still farming in his own right, still has a Longhorn herd as well. So he's been a great stalwart of the breed. And if you look back through the pedigrees over the last 40 years, then, you will see Rousham there in all of them in some respect, either bulls or females. So he's been a great stalwart, and along with John Brigg, they did take it on.
Let's talk about yourself, Clive. John Brigg took over as chairman of the society, and yourself replaced him as the secretary in 1975. And you would be an auctioneer by that time. Clive, would this be something you were doing alongside that, or was this a permanent role for yourself?
I left school and did an agricultural correspondence course and something in 1973 and joined John Thornborough, who just sold, as many of your listeners will remember, just sold pedigree cattle or pedigree livestock, but 95% of it would be pedigree cattle. And of course, as I said, the continental breeds were being imported from, apart from the Charolais in 1966, everything else was coming in from 1970 onwards. And in 1975, I would have been in 2 years into my employment with John Thornborough, just a trainee auctioneer. Obviously very interested in pedigrees coming from a farming family and so on. So John didn't live very far from me. We probably only lived about 5 or 6 miles apart and knew each other. By that time, it was starting to move forward. We'd had the hill dispersal in 73, as you mentioned, and it was gaining momentum really. And John was farming in his own right and still is. And basically, you can't do two jobs. So he approached John Thornborough and said, "Do you have anybody in your office that may be interested in taking this forward?" So I was approached, and I did it within my training as an auctioneer with John Thornborough & Co. So, yeah, I took over in 1975, and to keep some continuity, John Brigg was elected as chairman.
And an interesting job it would be as well back then, as we said earlier on. I mean, John would have put the records into shape, but you'd have new breeders and people coming in and new protocols arriving around every corner. And, of course, you were battling a little bit, as you said, against the Continentals that were putting you out on the wings a little bit. And
yeah, absolutely. And we put a new registration system in action, and it was starting. I wouldn't say John didn't run it professionally, because he did. And as I said earlier, we've got a debt of gratitude to John Brigg. But things move on, and we'd got the office equipment at 11 Priory Terrace Limited Spa, which is where we were based. And because it was starting to grow, it needed perhaps a bit more backup than John was able to offer.
Mm-hmm. Great, and a lot of people probably won't know that was where your humble beginnings came from, Clive. And in 1976, the RBST started its first sale, I think, at Stoneleigh, and with a few breeds, I guess, but that saw the dispersal of Simon Gilbey's Essex herd, and again, 5 new breeders coming in there: Raby Castle, Pat Quinn, Colonel Stewart from the Isle of Coll in Scotland. So we've got people coming in from further afield as well. And then moving on a little bit, in 1978 we saw 3 more dispersals from the Wintill herd, the Grendon herd, and the Ibrook herd, and this time involving 55 females and pulling in 22 new breeders by 1978. And Clive, that's just right in your term there. There must have been some marketing, I guess, to bring in some of these new breeders, which included Michael Rosenberg, Betty Weiner, and, of course, yourself, Peter. So Clive basically gave you a phone call one day and said, get down here and buy some of these Longhorns, did he?
No, a totally different story, really. We'd been running a herd of about 60 Hereford Friesians, and when I came home from university, we decided to expand them and put new sheds up and everything, and ended up with about 120, 150 suckler cows, all calving to the Charolais at that time. But we're running into problems with the Hereford Friesian was more of a Hereford Holstein. And we thought of calving, we're having problems with too much milk at calving, mastitis once the calves are weaned, and running into perhaps too much fat if they didn't calve straight away. So, well, then the other thing was with the Holstein blood, you were bulling in the winter and had to feed them like hell to make sure you got them all in calf.
Also, if I just jump in there, I know because we were involved in barley beef, as Clive will well know, in those 70s time, and when the Holstein came in there, it upset the beef job with us because we were feeding Friesian animals, and the Friesian was a lot easier flesh, whereas the Holstein would be much harder fleshed animal altogether, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and we thought, well, we'll have to change breed. We'll like the idea of the Hereford Shorthorn, but everything coming out of Ireland seemed to be what we call the double cross. There were 3/4 Herefords, and just didn't really milk well enough for us.
Well, Hereford, you would struggle to get Herefords of any size back then as well. I guess we're talking end of 70s here, or early 70s rather, that the Hereford had lost a lot of its scope, hadn't it?
Yeah, well, they'd be coming out of dairy shorthorn cows in Ireland, so they were still reasonably big, but certainly they weren't the answer anyway. And we decided to look at all the breeds. Ended up thinking the Welsh Black had something to offer, but not as a purebred. And it was a question of what you put it to. If you put it to a continental, we thought we'd get too big a hungry cow. If you went to a beef breed, perhaps they wouldn't milk well enough in the summer. Well, we'd put it on the back rather than milk. And if you went to a dairy type cross, then we're back where we just come from.
Yeah,
so
sure.
In the end, we chose between the white-bred shorthorn and the Longhorn, and the Longhorn got the nod basically because it has a huge pelvis, the biggest pelvic to body weight ratio of any breed. And so that's how we sort of hit the Longhorn track. Ended up buying a Longhorn bull.
Okay, and you say the big pelvic ratio there, pelvic area there, and that goes back to the initial size that these animals were going back into before Bakewell's day. I suppose they would be one of the biggest breeds in the country. Or they're just no bigger, but just a bigger pelvic area.
I think there'd be big rangy cattle, and that'd be part of what he tried to alter. Taking the hook bones off them and pushing more fat onto them, basically.
Fair dues, and I'm going to stand here in his corner a little bit. Fair dues, it did suit the marketing that he had in the same way that he did with the Leicester sheep, where he said the poor man wants to eat mutton or mutton fat, so they say. So he produced the animals that was for that market, and he produced the beef for that market that was needed. But as you said, maybe to the detriment of the size of them.
Yeah, well, that had two needs for the fat. It wasn't just the energy it gave to people who were manual labourers, and also to use in the lamps. The tallow was used in lighting the houses.
Mm-hmm. And going back to the Welsh Black, I believe then you started to cross the Longhorn with the Welsh Black, Peter. Again, it's quite an unusual cross, two native breeds from different ends of the country, but similar breeds in a lot of ways, I guess.
Yeah, we wanted a resilient cow that could cope with all conditions and could calve to the Charolais, even as a 2-year-old if necessary, and it absolutely fitted the bill tremendously. So we're sort of building up a herd of Longhorn Welsh Blacks, and then with the BSE problems of the 90s, we didn't have the problems, but the industry did, and the suckle calf job rather fell downhill. So we decided we'd try and market breeding heifers out of these Longhorn Welsh Blacks.
Okay. And
that's how we got into Simmentals, but I could perhaps come to that later. We had this Longhorn bull breeding us these tremendous Longhorn Welsh Blacks, and it just seemed natural, if we've got a Longhorn bull, we might as well have a few females. And actually, the first ones I got were bought from Aubrey Lowe's down in Devon, unseen, £200 a piece. I thought we couldn't go far wrong there. And then things happened, and it grew and grew from there.
So you went to a few pedigree sales yourself, though, and came home empty-handed, Peter.
Yeah, in 1978, there was 3 Longhorn sales advertised. We went to the first one, Mrs. Hutton's at Winthill, thinking we might get a few more females. I probably had a budget of round about 600-700. In actual fact, you couldn't buy much under 700 or 800. So we came home from there empty-handed. Mm-hmm. And then the next sale, the Grendon sale, we went down to that, and I changed my attitude. Rather than chasing animals up in price and basically pushing the trade up, I decided we'd just buy the best and just buy it regardless. And Michael Rosenberg had been founding his herd at the Winthill sale, and he was there, and 1 or 2 other buyers, and I had to buy the 2 what I consider the best cows there, and beat Michael Rosenberg to get them. And we actually met afterwards, and we were friends for life ever after that. He went on to fund the Longhorn stand at the Highland Show, which I ran from I think 1984 to 2004 when we got the Longhorn classes at the Highland.
Excellent. And the good females are never dear. Clive, I'll bring you in there. We say it all the time, and I know you've sold me sheep and cattle and various things over the years, and to everybody else in your pedigree role there. But if you're going to get into a breed, then buy the best you can afford and buy the best you can find. Is that right?
Absolutely. Just looking back at the averages, the Wintill herd, as Peter said, terrific interest. 1978, remember we're talking about. 10 cows and calves averaged 1,031, served heifers averaged 1,260, maiden heifers averaged 630. Yes, it's 1978 at Windhill, and as I said earlier, halcyon days for the beef trade. So all the breeds got a real lift from everything and the interest, as we're seeing now, to be honest. Mm-hmm. And then we had the Grendon sale, and Peter bought some good animals there. Cows and heifer calves averaged over 1,400, served heifers just 1,000. Maiden heifers 500. It was just on a roll, to be honest, and then we really hit the headlines when we got to Ibrook, because they averaged at over 1,400. You had Ibrook Teen at 3,000, and as Peter said, people the likes of Michael Rosenberg, Betty Weiner, Peter himself, just to spare his blushes. But you got people coming into the breed that not only, it was not all about money, it's about experience and employing people. And Betty Weiner had a great stockman, Les Impey, and Michael Rosenberg as well. And Peter was more than capable of taking it forward in his own right as far as skills of feeding and presentation and just showing what the breed could really do. So, once you had people that wanted to push it forward and could feed them, you could see how they were going to respond. So perhaps it wasn't so surprising looking back that there was so much interest.
Sure. And would you be selling those animals yourself at that time through John Thornborough?
At the Windhill sale, I remember, I can remember what I was wearing, let alone anything else, believe it or not, sad creature that I am. No, I was booking for John Thornborough at Windhill, but Grendon, I was allowed to actually conduct the sale because I was secretary of the society at that time and got all the pedigrees, and he said it's about time you did it. So plenty of interest there. And at the Ibrook sale, I sold those, half of them, because we had some horses that day as well. So we did that between us. But it's like everything else, Andy. When there's a good trade, anybody can sell them. It's when you hit a buffer that you need somebody with some experience. But no. Joking apart, they were comparatively easy sales to conduct because people wanted to get into the breed.
Sure, indeed, and that's the way, isn't it? As you said, when the demand is there, it's a bit easier. But I've seen you sell, Clive. You can sell most things to most people, that's for sure, including Ryland sheeps to me at far too much money over the past year or two.
Well, you're another one that keeps picking the best. So there you go.
My grandfather taught me well.
He did.
And Peter, going back to that, the cattle that you bought at the Grendon sale, just talk a few through those, because I think they were the ones that put the backbone in your Fishwick herd.
Yeah, I mean, they may have appeared expensive. I think it was 1,410 guineas for one and 1,600 for Grendon Dulcie. Between those two cows alone, I think they and their offspring produced 7 Royal Show female champions. Grendon Dulcie herself was actually champion in 84 and 85, and her daughter Hawthorne, who was at foot in 85, she was Royal Show champion in, I think, 87, 93 and 95.
Wow. Certainly made those purchases look fairly cheap then, as Clive just said.
Yeah. There must be a moral somewhere there.
The thing that surprises me, I'd get shot now. I don't know why I was taking 10 guinea bids at 1,400, but there we go.
Clive, that's some story that Peter's saying there, where he got started and winning all these shows there, and you'll back me up that he's definitely been a man on a mission and a man going forward, but it doesn't end there, does it?
No, absolutely not. And all credit to Peter. He understands cattle. He understands how to feed them. He understands how to present them. And if you've got a breed like the Longhorn that has the capabilities, you just want somebody to push it in the right direction and bring all its attributes to the surface, which Peter did extremely well. And if you look back through the breed pedigrees, even now you see so much Fishwick breeding. As a base for most of the better herds, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, so to speak. So, no, tremendous.
Indeed. Well, Peter, just talk us through where you went from those late 70s, and as you said, you won those shows, and some of the Ibrook cattle did you a great deal of good as well, I believe.
Yeah, at the Ibrook sale, we bought what was technically a dry cow, Ibrook Rachel. Paid 2,200 guineas for it, which seemed, even to me, exorbitant. But in due course, it proved money well spent. Rachel went to the Royal Show in 1980 with Wintill John, the stock bull that we've been using on the Welsh Blacks. We'd never shown anything before anywhere, apart from, I think, when I was 17, a Hereford heifer at Dunn's show. And we didn't come back with anything. I don't think we were actually bottom, but not far off it. And we then resolved to flush Rachel. She went away to a company that was called TA Saul Unlimited in Lincolnshire, which some of you may remember.
They were the first of the embryo transplant firms, TA Saul Unlimited at Sleaford in Lincolnshire. Right. The manager was a chap called Richard Digby, and they had their own vet and their own surgery and everything, and they pioneered ET in this country without question.
So was she successful with the flush there, Peter?
Well, she was away for 8 months, and I think we got 5 embryos total. But she came home, fat as butter, ready to show at the Royal.
Okay.
And went to the 1981 Royal Show and was champion. That was the year the Longhorns won the Burke Trophy. Mm. She was light in a quarter, so it was actually the second prize cow, Mrs. Weiner's Browsham Carnation, that went out to take the Burke Trophy with Ibrook Richard. We mentioned earlier the sale at Ibrook, and at that sale there was a very plain cow with a calf at foot, and Les Impey, who was Betty Weiner's stockman, had noticed this calf. I'd no idea if anybody else had, but anyway, they got the cow and calf for, I think, 850 guineas, and that calf was Ibrook Richard that came out, won the Burke Trophy under Ben Coots. A lot of people said the Longhorns were lucky, but in actual fact, John Dwyer, who had been leading Rachel for us in the show ring, mainly because he said that he knew the judge very well, but he won £20 from Robert de Tass, the Charolais breeder, betting that the Longhorns would win the Burke Trophy.
Brilliant, and we all know the story of Ben judging the animals there, and then telling the Queen. I think they were the only buggers that could walk, if I remember right. Was his words to the Queen on that particular day. And Ben, of course, one of life's great characters, and still recognised that these traditional breeds had their merits at a time when everybody else was looking to France. So it was a great day for the breed.
Yeah, I mean, Ben really concentrated on animals that could walk. I mean, we won the Longhorn, any other breed classes at Kelso Show many years after that when Ben was judging. Brian Walling had taken the Solaires all around the country, won everywhere with his pair of fantastic Solaires, and they turned up at Kelso Show in the same class as the Longhorns, and I think the championship was between our Longhorn and Ben Walling's bull, and Brian Walling's bull, and Ben Coots sent them up the ring, and the Longhorn got to the other end first. So they sent them up again, and the Longhorn won again that time. So the Longhorn got the championship.
Egg and spoon race, and they are a long-legged beast as well as the lure. So you had to do some quick walking yourself, I guess, to get up there. But Ben, some character I've talked about him on this podcast, and was a friend of mine in his later years. And as you said, a man that saw structure and the merits of the breed over and above what everybody else was looking for just for profit. And great that he stuck behind it. Those embryos, Peter, that we've digressed to a little bit there. One of those was Fishwick Daydream, is that right? And she went on to be a very great creature.
Yeah, we got 3 heifers from the embryos. The best of which was Daydream. Daydream went back to the Royal Show as a 3-year-old first calf heifer with a calf called Fantasy at foot, and we were standing around outside the Charolais tent where the AGM had been held, and Alan Goodland, who had just won the Charolais Championship with Lakelands and Jess, came out and saw them, and he came up to me and said, "If you can breed heifers like that, you're in the right breed."
It's a great credit, and Sir Jess was a fantastic animal as well, and of course Charolais would have been right in their heyday back then. Clive, that's some praise, isn't it? Daydream must have been some cow. Was that on your watch, Clive?
Absolutely. Daydream with fantasy. And of course, they were reserve female champion that day. I think that's probably what Alan Goodland was referring to. So, he could see the potential of them as well.
Yeah, Daydream was by Ben Garrick, and she bred tremendous females. The first calf that I've mentioned, Fantasy, was several times first at the Royal. I think twice reserve female champion. But she also was 5 times on the trot at the Great Yorkshire Show champion.
Wow.
And everybody was sick of her there, I think. her next daughter, Galaxy, bred Charisma, who was eventually sold to Germany, and she was the matriarch of Sabine Zentis's herd over there. And another daughter of hers is Jade. That's the mother of Charlie Sutcliffe's herd builder, Fishick Olympic.
Yeah. So definitely a breeding cow and a line that everybody would be looking for and probably still watching to this day. And by now, Peter, you'd built the herd up to 40-odd cows, I believe.
Yeah, we're just around about the 40 mark. In fact, I think there was only about 300 breeding Longhorn cows at that time. So we had well over 10% of the breeding females.
You did.
So whilst the 3 cows were purchased in 78 and later added Shugborough Campion, that gave us a good base, but it was clear that we weren't going anywhere really without the right bull. And we'd seen a bull called Rousham Goliath as a 2-year-old at the 1982 Royal. I think he was 3rd. He wasn't overfleshed, and we bought him from Charles Cottrell Dormer. He was delivered 2 months later, pretty emaciated because he'd been working very hard for previous 2 months. It actually took us 2 years to fully flesh him up, and he won the Royal in 1984, and he was Supreme Champion over Dulcie, who was Reserve Champion. But he really stamped his females. His sons weren't fantastic, but Goliath really bred females tremendously.
He was a female breeder, yeah. And then, of course, so you've got these great females out at Goliath. They need another bull now. Peter, they're hard to keep buying these bulls when most of the things in the country are all out of your own breeding to start with.
Well, we needed a bull to follow on to Goliath's daughters, and we actually saw a bull called Glaven Alliance at the 87 Royal Show, and he looked to fit the bill. He was Bio Rysham Ivor, who was to some extent related to Goliath, because on his mother's side he was line bred to Hill Texmus, and again he wasn't the biggest, but he had a tremendous back end and passed it on to his offspring. Probably the most notable of which was Fishick Kinsmen out of Fantasy. And Phil Evans bought Kinsmen as a 10-month-old calf off his mother at the Royal Show in 89.
Wow, he must have seen it.
And it was really Kinsmen that put a lot of the backsides into the breed rather than Alliance. He nicked really well with Phil's... Well, he had a bull called Glantrossi Kestrel that I think it had been reared on Adler milk from dairy cows.
You're not allowed to say that.
But it was out of Fishick fanfare, and it helped to spread the genetics right through the breed.
Okay. Mentioned, just going back there, just briefly, obviously we've had a little bit of a downer for our Bakewell fans earlier on, but a little bit of close breeding there, and it must have been quite hard to get away from that close breeding. Bakewell left us this legacy where we could breed fathers on daughters and daughters on back to the sons and such like, but it must have been actually quite difficult to find outcrosses or find crosses that were, if they were going to be line bred, then they would have to be exactly the right ones to catch the faults there, Peter.
Not really. I don't want to get too technical, but Bakewell, I've looked at some of Bakewell's animals, Twopenny and so on, and they're not as hugely inbred as was made out. There's a method of measuring it, and he was working around about 15 to 18% inbreeding. Is
that all? Okay.
As a guide, half brother to half sister is 12.5, and sire on daughter is 25. So he wasn't out of the window. We're quite happy to inbreed up to 15-20%, maybe not 20, but 15 to 18%, which is exactly what he was doing.
Certainly, it's something I've studied as well, going back the way as well from great breeders, and some breeders still out there would tell me this as well. You can go up to 12.5% if you on a regular basis and keep it that way, and everything runs fine. So he's not too far out the ballpark, is he?
No, and a lot of those cattle at the Ibrook sale, they were around about the 25 to 30% inbred, which is nearly twice as much as Bakewell was doing.
Sure. Sure. So you bought the Bull Alliance. So he's your next big thing. Peter was to put you right.
Yep, he was a super little bull. He wasn't huge, but he bred well. Unfortunately, and Kerry Long, his breeder, won't mind me saying so, she'd reared him almost as a pet. And he had a super nature, but he had no idea what discipline was. And we had him for 2 years, and he had no respect whatsoever for gates, especially wooden ones. We thought he was probably starting a kindling business. Anyway, he ended up dismantling 2 in a week. And then my son Rob was about 14 at the time. He walked straight through him with a stick, not any nastiness about it, but just walked through him. So I'm afraid he went to the happy hunting ground. And it was only the next year that we really appreciated what amazing calves he could
Yeah,
show.
it's a shame, isn't it? We all know in a lot of other breeds, and again discussed regularly on this podcast, that there are some females and bulls that breed that temper through to the next one. But it's such a docile breed. Are the Longhorns there? I'd imagine you didn't want to breed with one that hadn't got the right attitude. But it sounds like you wish you'd kept him a bit longer, all the same.
Well, we couldn't afford the gates.
As you said, he left the back ends there, and what were the notable bulls that he left behind in the Fishwick herd?
Well, he certainly left a worthy legacy. I wouldn't say bulls-wise, other than Phil Evans's Kinsmen. But Germany's Charisma that I've already mentioned, Blackbrook's Kestrel and Crystal that they bought from Alan Dunseith and Jim Swindon were both by him. Southfield's Fishwick Loyalty was by him. And the Crockmore herd's stock bull, Fishwick Cosmic, was by him. And Cosmic, for a long time, was the breed record priced bull. Unfortunately, when he went away to the rare breed sale, Daydream had just calved, and just literally that morning. And whilst we were away, she ended up doing the splits. Oh. And when we came back, she ended up being shot.
That's a shame.
So, in actual fact, it would have been better shooting the bull and staying at home. But that's history.
And the record price, what price are we talking about, and what year, Peter?
That was 3,400.
Okay.
But most of all, really, of all Alliance's offspring, I think Karen was the most influential and most important. Uh-huh. She was an amazing animal. The breed Nature Craft model is of her. And she bred Fishwick Donna, the 2005 Royal Show breed champion. Pat Stanley loved Karen, and when she bought her daughter Candace at our sale in 2003, I was actually a bit naughty when she asked what I was telling her. As I replied, "We've got a better one at home."
We'll heard that one.
Can you repeat the reply you got or not?
I think she was gobsmacked.
She didn't say, "I'll have that one as well," then.
No, I don't think anything came out of the man.
Peter, in between these times, you won 11 Royal Show female champions, 5 reserve females, 5 champion junior heifers. A lot of females going on here, but it must have got harder and harder as the breed numbers started to increase and get harder to win. Maybe you just had to go a bit deeper into the feedback, maybe.
Yeah, there was more people came into the more professional end of the showing ring. I have to admit, we weren't in a position to start feeding them the year before and bring them through the winter ready for showing. So we had to sort of bring it a bit, really. And perhaps we did take our eye off the ball a bit because we'd become involved with the Simmental and we're showing them as well. We bought a Simmental bull to put onto the Longhorn Welsh Blacks in 1989. Really to market breeding heifers, because not many people were wanting a Charolais cross heifer as a suckler cow. And a little bit like the Longhorns, the fact we had a Simmental bull seemed to necessitate the need to have some females.
Yeah.
So we got into those, and that grew and grew and grew. And at one point, we ended up with, I think, 120 pedigree Simmentals and 40 pedigree Longhorns.
Wow. Okay.
Which was a bit over the top, but it was really precipitated by the 2001 foot and mouth, which just seemed to occur as we were about to have a reduction sale.
Oh dear. Okay, and the Simmentals, We'll go on to it, I think, maybe slightly later. But without being too controversial, Peter, your reign over the breed started to slow down around about that time, come the millennium, and a few other breeders started jousting for those medals.
Yeah, I mean, obviously competition was increasing, and if 1981 to 95, 96, 97 belonged to Fishwick, it's only fair to say that the end of the 90s and the 2000s unto the Royal Show demise belonged mostly to Blackbrook and Southfield. The Pat Stanley and John Stanley at Blackbrook and David and Angela Blockley at Southfield. Established in 89, Blackbrook had acquired 6 or 7 Goliath and Alliance daughters from breeders who had supported our production sales, notably Tony Hearn, the Simmental breeder, and Alan Dunsey from Jim Swindon, they were retired engineers who wanted a hobby for their retirement and decided that breeding Longhorns was it. Mm-hmm. But Pat's done an amazing job combining these lines in a very Bakewellian manner, breeding in and across each line of the Longhorns, and just produced a much meatier, neater Longhorn that, along with David and Angela at Southfield, they've really dominated the show ring in recent years. And likewise at Southfield, they also acquired 6 or 7 foundation females from Fishwick. Well, not necessarily from us, but Fishwick females. The most influential within their herd was Fishwick Lark, which is an Alliance daughter out of Gamble, who was the one we mentioned earlier that was at foot to Dulcie at the Royal Show in 84.
Pat actually wrote a book, didn't she? Because I know when I was researching for Bakewell and for some of this podcast, the book has been on my shelf for many years, and I hadn't read it, and I took to reading it, and a fantastic story she put there.
Yes, to be fair to Pat, she did a lot of research for that book and produced it extremely well, and it's a bit of a benchmark, really, in many respects. Out
there, available on Amazon as we speak, I'm sure. And Peter, going back to your story here, you've now got down to 40 Longhorns and 120 Simmental cows. Looked like you were going in a totally different direction, but then another change of tack. Perhaps you backed the Simmentals down a little bit, did you?
Yes. Since 2001, we've rationalised things a bit, reducing the Simmental numbers. I think there were maybe still are too many breeders chasing the bull market. So we're now focusing on the Longhorns and also producing Longhorn cross bulling heifers, which market seems to be exploding.
Longhorn cross Simmental bulling heifers. Am I right there in that? Yes.
Yeah, That's right. Yeah. I mean, there's prominent breeders, commercial breeders like the Sutherlands at Sidmouth near Thurstow, and the Barclays at Hairstone, who are using the Longhorn Simmental as a commercial suckler cow, and they're putting them to Charolais and Belgian Blues, I think. Okay. And Stuart Dodd at Lockerbie, he's using the Longhorn Cross Limousin and the Longhorn Cross South Devon. But pedigree-wise, I mean, we sorted ourselves out after the turn of the century, and we purchased in 2004, jointly with Andrew Nelson and the McClungs at Kelso, Bernard Llewellyn's Carrick Kennan, which had been round the show circuit winning everywhere. And that was for a breed record of 8,400 at Melton Mowbray.
Wow. Is that still the record?
For a bull, yes, I think so. Yeah. Kennan really re-established the power and stretch that we'd been looking for in our Longhorns. And it was his son, Fishwick Lord of the Rings, out of Crockmore Foxglove. He was born in 2011, and that really got us going again. Foxglove was a lovely, well-balanced cow, carried both Kinsmen and Optimist on the sire side, and Goliath and the Lions through Cosmic on the dam side. And we showed him extensively in 2012 as a yearling. I think we went to about 15 shows and got, I think, 56 points in the Bull of the Year competition, where normally a bull with 25 would win it. Okay. He won again in 2013, and he's actually still going strong. But he looks like being superseded by another bull out of Foxglove. And that bull is by McCavity, which was a young bull out of Donna that won the Royal Show in 2005. Unfortunately, we lost McCavity when he put his stifle out a couple of years ago. But his son, out of Laurie's mother, is a bull called Philandra, and he is something really exceptional. And I think it'll take us and the breed a long way forward, hopefully.
Excellent. So that's full circle, 40 years we just said, or very nearly, and you're still there at the top, and sounded like you've got something still exciting there to be turning out when we get some more shows going again, Peter. And if we move on to the crossbred side of it, you would sell now a lot of bulls from your herd there, going on to all sorts of animals, I guess, across the country.
Yeah, I mean, we're selling about, at the moment, probably 10 bulls a year, and half the inquiries we get and half the sales we get are for Longhorn bulls to go on to commercial herds trying to breed better replacements. A lot of them going on to Simmentals, Anguses. In the past, quite a few went on to Galloways, although I haven't had so many inquiries for that recently. They were even putting them on to Highlands out on the west coast and on some of the islands.
Fantastic cross that would be. I'd love to see that. I mean, Peter, you mentioned that you sell a lot of your bulls into the suckler commercial herd, and of course a lot of these guys will be wanting bulls that are dehorned. So I assume it must be a decision you have to make at a young age or a weaning age that you're going to lop the horns off these bulls, and which ones you're going to keep the horns on. And is there a market out there, or maybe a chance of breeding a polled Longhorn one day, maybe?
Yeah, as far as dehorning is concerned, yes, quite a few of the commercial breeders do want them with the horns off. We probably take a random decision which ones would take the horns off. We use paste, which works quite well, as long as you make sure the cow doesn't lick the paste off.
Yes.
And as far as polling is concerned, I actually got it through the AGM in 1983 that we could grade up, not into the full herd book, into a separate polled register. Each animal has to contain the word pole in its name, and you have to start off with pure beef bloodlines, obviously one of which will be polled.
Okay.
At the moment, we're actually doing it using an Angus with a Longhorn bull, and then to comply with the regulations we set up, we go back for 5 generations to a pure Longhorn bull.
Okay.
To get up to 31, 32.
A little bit closer than some of the Americans do, but again, I don't want to upset my American listeners. They're great people. Clive, you might have been involved in that. Sounds like it was still while you were in the secretary time there. There must have been a hell of a resistance against that from some of the very traditional listeners, of which we have plenty on this program, to say we're bastardizing what is a breed by name.
Yeah, actually, I'd probably just finished because I then went to McCartneys in '84, so I was just winding down with the Longhorns as far as the secretaryship's concerned. But obviously, being in the industry, it's an ongoing debate, and that's got to be a good thing for all concerned. But some people call it progress, some people don't. But that's beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. But you can't argue with the commercial attributes that a commercial man probably doesn't want cattle with a lot of horns about them, to be honest. So that's just straightforward management.
There are the purists out there who will say that as soon as you take the horns off them, it's no longer a Longhorn. Peter, would I be right?
We seem to have, even amongst rational commercial breeders, a mental block to taking the horns off a Longhorn. They're happy to dehorn Charolais and Simmentals, but they still say, "Oh, you can't dehorn a Longhorn."
Not dehorn, they've polled the Limousin and they've polled the Charolais for that matter as well, but then I think they probably got away with that because they're a newer breed. They're not standing behind what is close on 300 years of history to where that was one of their resounding features, and obviously where the name came from.
Yeah, and we are now allowed to show Longhorns without horns in the show ring.
You can show them without horns, but not polled.
I'll qualify that. We're allowed to dispud them and show them. We can't dehorn them and show them.
That clears that up. We've had a fantastic history going back of the way on the Longhorns. Peter, we probably need to talk about a few more prominent herds, apart from just Fishwick, which that's for all Fishwick have been instrumental in being behind the breed so much now, and possibly the blood is in just about all the other breeds. Who are the breeders out there now that we're looking at in the Longhorn breed that the genetics are in demand?
Inevitably, you've got to look towards the volume bull breeders. when you consider what impact other herds have on the breed. And there's obviously Blackbrook and Southfield that I've mentioned earlier. And embarrassingly, all the other main influences are also founded or strongly imbued with fishing blood. But Bernard Llewellyn at Carrick Kennan, Bernard and I have swapped or shared bulls for the past couple of decades, and actually currently share Lord of the Rings. Okay. You have to look at Graham Lennox at Aberdeen. Aberdeen bloodlines, virtually all go back to fishing chauvinists. It's called Aberdeen. It was the city farm at Aberdeen, and then the Lennox family took over the cattle, so they had a new herd number. But I think they've been allowed to retain the herd name. Okay. And then there's Charlie Sutcliffe at Tetford. Charlie's herd, his sort of foundation stock bull was Fishing Olympic, which was a grandson of Daydream by Longgrove Resolve, and he's now using an equally impressive Fishing Prosperity by McAvity. Okay. A newer breeder, Bertie Fasson at Gentons, he's hit the ground running really in the show ring with judicious purchases right across the breed, and he got a drove of McAvity daughters and Lord of the Rings daughters from us. I would like to mention some past herds that have been particularly influential, and that's Nikki Luckett, our current president at Wellhead. She used to sell a lot of bulls, and they've had a big impact in the breed. And former members and breeders who are unfortunately not with us, John Backhouse at Raincliffe and Phil Evans at Linton, okay. and probably John and Joshua Brigg at Gorse. Mm-hmm.
And when I lived back near home in Worcestershire, we had a neighbour down the way who bred a lot of geese, and he was into Longhorns as well. Or a lady called Judy Goodman. Do they still breed us, Clive?
Yeah, Judy Goodman would be obviously goose guru, whereas her son Andrew has now got a very sizable herd of Longhorns, does extremely well with them, is very committed to them, produces a lot of commercial steers, which would stand next to any Continentals in the marketplace as far as price is concerned. Just going to add to what Peter was saying about other influential breeders, and he just touched on Gorse. And just going back to John Brigg, of course, back to the end of the 60s, early 70s, and what he did for the breed. And, of course, had his own herd, which he dispersed a couple of years ago. And we were talking about big prices in 1976 going on into 1978. But, of course, he holds a record for a cow with a bull calf at foot at 12,000 guineas. Wow. So perhaps we're starting another era where the breed leaps on again, because everything ebbs and flows, and perhaps we've seen some ebbing in the last few years with the Longhorns, but perhaps it's set to flow again. And, with the interest that there was in that sale and subsequent sales and the beef industry as a whole, I think things are set fair well. I think the breed is set fair well.
And that's something else I suppose I should mention. I know there was a crowd down the road from us called Happy Meat, so I think they sold Goodman's meat. And is there a market out there, Peter? Are you finding a market for purebred or three-quarter bred or Longhorn beef, as there are with Highlands and Galloways and all the other traditional breeds that we're featuring just lately?
Well, we used to do beef boxes many years. In fact, I was one of the first ones to start doing beef boxes, but we packed up that 20 years ago, I think. We keep thinking we should start again. And as far as our own meat sales are concerned, basically we're selling everything for breeding apart from a handful of castrates that go into the Carlisle Mart.
Sure. But Clive, you're saying you're seeing a few coming through your beef sales in the markets, are you?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it is a niche market. Obviously there's certain celebrity chefs that are very keen on Longhorn beef, and it's had a lot of publicity via that avenue.
That would be Mr. Heston Blumenthal.
Farm shops are selling it because, like most native breeds, there's good marbling through the meat. It cooks well, it tastes well. And when you've got that combination, people come back to buy more.
Sure. And Clive, as an auctioneer, you have a lot of the main pedigree sales, certainly in England now, coming through McCartneys. And we seeing a massive demand for native breeds, of which this series is all about there in the sheep and the cattle. Is the Longhorn a breed that you see growing again? Are we rising in popularity again? Is the demand coming there? More people coming in, queuing up for the pure sales?
Yeah, I'm certainly, there is a place for them. I'm not suggesting that they are going to blow the Herefords and the Angus and some other continental breeds out of the water, because I don't think they will. But as Peter has well explained earlier in the debate, that the suckler cow is probably the way forward for the Longhorn. There's certain dairymen that would use a Longhorn for the calf and the Butilar scheme and so on. So there's niche markets out there for the Longhorns without question. Whether they will ever become a dominant beef breed, I would hesitate to suggest that. But there is certainly a marketplace for them, probably more on the suckler cow side, but there is a use for, use of the Longhorn bulls on heifers and so on. And as for most native breeds, they are coming back into fashion.
Yeah. And am I right in thinking that McCartneys do have the national sale of Longhorns at Worcester?
Yes, we do. We have a couple of sales a year, plus production sales and dispersal sales, and we've been conducting those sales since, as we said earlier, the early 1970s. So we're very proud to be involved with them on a personal and a company level.
You certainly would be proud, Clive, on a personal level. It's a hell of a journey you've been through with the breed, even longer than Peter here. And Peter, that's a fantastic story that we've heard about Fishwick going through the way. Is there anything else you want to add, Peter, yourself?
No, other than we did sort of mention regrets, and I do have regrets of 3 or 4 bulls that we haven't made maximum use of. That
I think Clive and myself and possibly our listener won't be worrying too much about your heartfelt regrets there. Peter, for a man who's been at the top of the breed for nigh on 40 years, sounds like you've still got some of the best goods there in town, and most of the breeding in the country goes back to yourself there. Absolute credit to you for what you've done through the breed and for the way you've underpinned it with your commitment through councils and various other ways. And likewise, Clive, for your absolute commitment as well, and commitment to both of you helping me today on this podcast and getting the true history, I hope, a satisfactory history, should I say, of the Longhorn breed out there to people that maybe wouldn't know all about it.
It's been great to talk to you, Andy, as always, and always good to see you in the market as well. And it's good to catch up with Peter again as well. We've had a long journey and we haven't finished it yet, hopefully. So, no, thank you, Andy, for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Clive. Yeah, Peter, thank you.
It's been a pleasure to chat to both of you.
Okay. Thanks again for listening to this week's Top Lines and Tails podcast. Once again, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Harbro, who are, of course, suppliers and manufacturers of quality livestock nutrition and nutritional advice. Visit their website for more information, or find them on Facebook. And whilst on Facebook, why not look up the Top Lines and Tails Facebook page, where you'll find lots of photographs and other information to back up this and other episodes.